Good morning, this is Brent with Lykins Motorsports, and this morning we are continuing a little bit of work on our 289. We're still waiting for pistons to arrive. I try to take advantage of when I have parts and pieces here to go ahead and get sub-assemblies done. This morning I'm going to focus on getting our rocker arm geometry correct and getting our push rod length so I can go ahead and get those from trend and get those on the way. And that will kind of check off some things on the list that need to be done before the engine goes together. There's no rotating assembly in the engine. If you look down spark plug hole, you don't see nothing. There's no pistons or crank or anything in here. You don't need it to do what I'm doing. I've got the camshaft and the cam gear. Got our lifters in on a small block Ford 8.2 deck. The lifters have to go on before the heads go on. Otherwise, you cannot get the lifters in. So just remember that. Got our push rod length checker on here. Got checking springs because I am using the lifters that we will be running. These are Morel lifters, and they are hydraulic lifters, and we don't want to compress the plunger and the lifter. So I've got checking springs on. Makes it really easy to push the valve down. Push rod length checker. We're going to be using some comp cams, ultra gold, full roller rockers, roller tip, roller trunnion, 1.6 ratio. So there's multiple ways of checking Valvetrain geometry. You've heard a lot of people talk about mid-lift geometry, that sort of thing. It doesn't matter what you use as long as you arrive at the right conclusion. So we are looking for a narrow rocker arm pattern across the valve stem. And it doesn't have to be centered on the stem, but we don't want it hanging off one edge or the other. Anywhere near the center is going to be good. If it's a narrow pattern, that means that all of the motion of the push rod and the rocker arm are translating to movement of the valve. We want lift of the valve. We don't want scrub motion across the rocker arm or across the valve tip. So as you can see, I've been trying some other things already. That is not what we want. That's a pretty wide pattern, and we're going to get some things narrowed down here. So I'm going to get my rocker arm on, and we'll get the push rod length adjusted, and we'll see what kind of motion we get. All right, let's talk about a few things first, just some prerequisites for further discussion. All of these aftermarket parts have to work together, and they're aftermarket parts, so they are not guaranteed to work together. So we have to do some just checking. I originally had, these are inch and 3/4. It's called the effective length stud. That means from underside of this flange, the hex part, to the tip of the rocker stud is 1 3/4 inch. I originally had these studs. These are 2 inches from the bottom to the top. What happens when you have something that's too long in the rocker arm stud, then these are called poly locks. You screw these nuts down over the stud, and then you lock it down with a set screw. If your stud is too long, then you can adjust your nut part, but your set screw is hanging way out, and you don't have significant engagement of this set screw. This is what I ran into earlier. This is actually in full discourse or disclosement of what I've been doing here. I originally had some Harlan Sharp rockers, equal quality to these comp, but when I shortened the push rod to get the pattern that I wanted, the rocker arm body down here was contacting the radius on the rocker arm stud. So let me show you this section here in the trunnion is much wider on these comp rockers than the Harlan Sharps. So that allows me to get the geometry that I want. Otherwise, I was bottoming out with the Harlan Sharp rockers. I would shorten my push rod to get the geometry that I want, but the rocker arm body itself would bind up on this radius portion on the stud, and I didn't have no clearance. I couldn't wiggle it like that. So you kind of have to know, you know, these are factory parts, and we're trying to make them, bring them into the modern era. And when you start using aftermarket rocker arm studs, guide plates, this and that, you know, valves, valve links, whatever, then you kind of have to have maybe a few parts on the shelf so you can try some different things. But I shortened my rocker stud, and now I have adequate set screw engagement, so I can go ahead and run my set screw all the way down to get full thread engagement on that. I have clearance around the rocker arm stud for the rocker arm body, and we have significant push rod clearance. And now we're just going to roll the engine over and see what kind of geometry we get. And we take time to ensure that we don't have push rod engagement. That's full lift. Push rod is a mile away from the rocker arm body. We don't have any issues with binding the bottom of the fulcrum against the rocker arm stud. So now it's just a matter of fine-tuning our geometry by manipulating the push rod length. And again, we are looking at how the roller tip rolls across the valve stem. And then we can adjust that pattern by adjusting the length of the push rod. So in an FE, this is done, you don't have poly locks, you don't have rocker arm studs, you have shaft mounted rockers. So all of the rocker arms are constrained to one shaft, and they are held to the head with stands. So that means in order to nail your geometry, instead of lengthening and shortening the push rod, you raise up the stand or you shorten the stand to get the geometry across the valve stem that you want. I make those laser cut steel shims to put under the stands on FEs to raise them up. To lower, then you have to mill the bottoms of the stands in order to get the geometry that you want. So we'll take our poly lock off. That is a fairly narrow, let me grab some calipers. Fairly narrow pattern, but I think that I think we can improve on it maybe a little bit. We'll see. So it's about a 60 thousandths wide pattern. And I think we can do just a little bit better than that. So what I'm going to try to do is lengthen our push rod just a little bit, and we'll try it again. All right, so I don't claim to be the brightest man in the world. I forgot to measure the push rod before I was going to show you what the change was. I basically unscrewed this thing about a full turn, so probably 50 thousandths of an inch or so. But I should have done that and didn't. But here's the result that we got. Really narrow pattern. You can see it. Let me grab, switch hands here, and we'll show you the width. So we went from about a 60 thousandths wide pattern down to a 50. And what we can do now is measure valve lift and see what we're getting. But I'm going to be pretty satisfied with that rocker arm pattern there. All right, so I was able to take a little bit of care and measure this without having to hold the camera and everything. So I'm measuring about a 45 thousandths wide pattern. That's typically that's when you know things are dialed in pretty good. A lot of the times you see 80, 70, 80 thousandths wide stuff. That usually can be improved upon. Even 60 thousandths, you can kind of nail it down a little bit further. But what we can do now is take our push rod length checker and measure the length of it. This one measures 6.265. Generally, they sell these in 25 thousandths increments. So 6.275 would be very, very close. And what I didn't take into account was preload. So that is something that I add in at the end. And I set, when I did this geometry track, I just used 0 lash with no preload. So if you want to know how much preload to add to your push rod length, one full turn, again, trying to do this on camera, it's very difficult. One full turn of your poly lock is about 50 thousandths of an inch. So we usually run these with half a turn or preload, so 25 thousandths. So if I'm ordering push rods today, I'm going to go, we were at 6.265, I'm going to add about 10 to get that 25 thousandths increment, so 6.275, and then half of 50 is 25, so we're going to end up with about a 6.300 push rod length. So just one more clearance check, a couple of places that you want to check for clearance: rocker arm body to your rocker arm stud, poly lock to rocker arm body as you go through the range of motion, and push rod to rocker arm body. So we're in good shape there. So I'm going to order those push rods and get those on the way, and then we can go ahead and start putting our guide plates in. All right, so I use this Permatex thread sealant on the bottoms of the studs. What you can do is get those rolled down and get your push rod in there, and then you can take your rocker arm. See, that is not centered, and you can see what's happening in the background. We've got some scissor action with our guide plates right here, and you want to get that rocker arm centered on the tip, and then I can hold this in place with one hand, and I can torque this stud with the other hand, and these torque at 55 pound-feet, and then I can jump across and do the other one. Okay, so that's a pretty, I guess, tedious process. You just kind of roll through it, and kind of boring actually. But just set your guide plates, since they are adjustable. It makes it really nice since you can individually pivot each rocker arm. And like I said, I just go through and make sure like both lifters are on the heel or close to it. Put a push rod in, lay a rocker arm on, and just make sure that it's centered on the valve stem, and that's all you got to do. Then when put some thread sealant on the studs and torque them down. Again, they torque at 55 pound-feet for cast iron heads. So once all that is done, we can also at this time check how our intake manifold interfaces with our cylinder heads. Both have been ported and both report match to a specific gasket. So it's not uncommon to have to mill intake manifolds since, you know, blocks have been cut, heads have been shaved, this and that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the intake on, and since it is a dual plane manifold, I can take my bore scope and snake it down through the plenum and see how the ports line up. So let's see if we can do that now. So the first thing I notice is that I essentially have no clearance here on the channel walls. You start off without gaskets, and then you see where the intake ports line up to the head ports without the gasket. I have a good feeling that this intake will need to be cut. We'll sneak a bore scope down the plenum. In the event that the intake needs cut, we'll also have to cut the channel walls on the intake, both front and back, because what happens when it's not the case with an FE, but with a small block, once you pull the bolts down, here's the threads right here, it pulls straight down, which wedges the intake down into this valley. So you lose clearance. So even when we mill the intake, if we have to make the ports line up, we're gonna have to make a cut on here too, so we can have enough clearance that we don't bottom out when we bolt the intake down. If you bottom out here, then it'll hold the ports up. It'll hold the intake off the gasket, and then you have all kinds of problems. So just good geometry things to check before you get further down the road with the intake and the cylinder heads. But let's stick our bore scope down here and see what we look like. Okay, so this is how everything matches up. There's a little shiny spot there because of the light coming out of the bore scope, but everything matches up really, really well, as I figured it would. So if it lines up without no gasket, then the intake has to be cut. The intake has to be cut the thickness of the gasket. So going to use some Mr. Gasket intake manifold gaskets for this one. They're 60 thousandths thick. So let's go over some geometry stuff. If we cut the flanges on the intake 60 thousandths, that will substitute our gasket. China wall will sit exactly the way that it looks now. So that will not work. So there again, we're going to have to mill our china wall on our intake to make it, to give us some decent clearance here. All right, so that's going to pretty much wrap it up for this video. I'm going to get this intake off and get our engine back to where it was. Valve springs put back on, and get the lifters out and get everything ready for when the pistons and everything show up. Did get our trend push rods ordered, and expect those probably by the middle of next week. But other than that, we are playing the waiting game, which is typical. But I appreciate you guys, and thank you for watching the video today. Thank you for sticking around with me. Make sure and hit that subscribe button and hit that like button. We took a family vacation this week to Pennsylvania, and I'm just going to share some personal stuff with you today. But we toured Hershey and Lancaster and went to Gettysburg, and then on our way back we stopped at Shanksville at the Flight 93 Memorial. And if you haven't been to that, I would recommend it. I'm going to put some pictures up here in a second. But it's a pretty sobering experience, knowing that so many people lost their lives right there. And a long time ago, 21 years ago almost. And I remember exactly what I was doing at the time. I decided to skip a class that morning. I was going to college, and I remember I was listening to Bob and Tom on the radio, and they kind of interjected into their program that the World Trade Center had been hit. But it's a very sombering place to be, and just shows the flight line that the airplane took and the impact area, and also the names of all the people that lost their lives there. So if you haven't been there, I would recommend it. Take a few minutes and just soak it all in. All right, guys. I don't know if I'll have another video for you this week, but hopefully we have some parts rolling in next week, and we can continue on our engine builds. Y'all have a good weekend.